Hello, dear listeners. Coming at you with a new episode as we get to the end of what John and I are referring to as Infinite Library Season 1. And today's episode is a great conversation with friend of the pod, Sam Chirtel. He's a guy that I wanted to have on the pod to talk sci-fi because he is an expert. He's getting his PhD in it. And I don't know, Sam just brings a great energy to the show and a lot of helpful definitions because we're covering, you probably saw in the title episode, Blindsight by Peter Watts, which is a really strange kind of hybrid of hard sci-fi, weird fiction, some soft sci-fi, and a lot of like actual quoting studies on consciousness, which like the characters don't, say like according to this study, but Peter Watts provides a really helpful works cited page at the end of the book, which we talk about during the conversation. But it's a great book, upsetting, but also meticulously researched. And we got into some heady stuff in this episode, conversations about consciousness, free will, hard sci-fi versus soft sci-fi, Lovecraft again, even the Gothic. John and I are noticing we're a trend of Gothic and Lovecraft is appearing in the last couple episodes. So maybe we'll explore that in the next season. But we got a lot of good stuff coming down the pipe. And so please remember to like and subscribe. You can follow us on Twitter at Infinite Library Podcast. And we're also basically on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. So we hope you enjoy this episode, and we'll see you guys soon for the end of season 1. Welcome back, listeners, to the Infinite Library. I'm your host, Ben.
And I'm your host, John.
And we're here to talk Blindsight by Peter Watts, the 2006 cosmic horror, hard sci-fi, weird alien encounter book. And I've brought the big guns on the podcast, a scholar of science fiction, and just a general all-around great guy. I'd like to introduce friend of the pod, Sam Chirtel.
Hey there, kids. I'm Sam. I am claiming to be an expert in weird fiction.
And I said we need to get Sam on the pod. We got to do sci-fi, and I feel like I should explain this book choice as well. So another friend of the pod, Ben. I had been telling Ben, who's a big metalhead, to watch Mandy, if anyone has seen that great movie, for like 3 years. And he finally did it. And he goes, yeah, I thought it was only kind of metal. And I was like, fair. But then he sent me this book in the mail as an example of metal science fiction. And he basically was like, you should check this out. I think it's as metal as Mandy, if not more. And so that's why we're doing this episode today.
Yeah. This is, I was curious. So, Ben, I know you just kind of laid out your story there of how this book made its way into your hands. Was this the first time through this book for both of you guys?
Yes.
This was actually my second time, which I feel is actually maybe a first for the podcast for me. I'm trying to think if there's anything else we've read that I've been through multiple times already. This is a book I read a little over a year ago, but it was on my radar for a bit before that. I really like space horror as like a concept, and this was a book that when I went to people asking for space horror recommendations, this one came up a lot, and I think this is definitely like out of a couple books in this genre I've read, this is definitely the one that I think is most effective at what it's trying to do, both as like a horror novel, a science fiction novel, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, definitely enjoyed it a lot on a reread, which definitely found some things in there that I did not get the first time. This is a really interesting book. I think, we'll get into it, but this is a book that I think is very intrigued by like how like convincing people of ideas works. And I think that it's yeah, very seductive in your first reading, and then I think on a second reading, it's a lot actually. You're able to see kind of some of the holes in there a little bit more clearly, both kind of in terms of the narrative and the ideas it's putting forth. And I don't even mean that in a bad way. I think that that's actually very intentional on Watts's part.
I like that you're making it sound like Persuasion by Jane Austen, which I actually just watched the very underrated 2022 movie version of yesterday. But yeah, absolutely. Never trust anyone who's trying to persuade you of anything, even if they're a hard sci-fi vampire.
Well, that's the thing. So this usually gets labeled in a lot of genres, and one of them is hard science fiction. And my impression of a lot of hard science fiction is characters just having really intelligent conversations with not a whole lot of concern for the reader. And so Watts is sort of just like, you can just kind of catch up basically with like what we're talking about. And that's one of the interesting things in terms of persuasion. Like, yeah, never trust a hard science fiction character if they're using too many elaborate metaphors that what their explanation of reality is real. And hard science fiction, which is I think one of the couple of the genres of this book, is a lot of concerned with like factual reality and writing a science fiction story that's like actually plausible and logically researched. And so a lot of what happens in at least the ones that I've read, which I've not read a whole lot, but I've read a couple, is like a lot of one character will say, well, I don't agree with this. And then another character who's usually like the author's stand-in will go like, that's because you haven't thought about this. And then like drop some knowledge on you. And then you as the reader are like, oh, okay, I think I'm slowly being persuaded as to this being like a real thing.
Pam is our resident expert on science fiction for the day. Is that accurate? Do you want to tell the kids at home what hard science fiction is in so many words?
I think it's pretty fair. So I actually wrote a paper about the difference between hard and soft science fiction for a narrative theory class a couple years back. And so I read a lot of the criticism, and you're definitely right, Ben, that a lot of the critics, like Brian Stableford, has written a good history and analysis of hard sci-fi, which I believe was published in Extrapolations, the harder of the two sci-fi criticism journals. And it's about the decision-making process of science and about collaboration and competition among scientists. The classic hard sci-fi story is something like 2001: A Space Odyssey, where every character is a scientist. And you listen to their debates about what to do and how what's going to happen. So the difference, I do some computational text analysis, and I came up with what I claim and what showed up to be a pretty solid measurable difference between hard and soft science fiction. And that's hard science fiction. There are more words about things than words about people.
Nice. Yeah.
So when you do like topic modeling or just basic, a computer notices what the common words and how they're associated are. If you run a Jules Verne novel through it, 7 out of 10 of the top topic words are stuff, like kinds of metal, kinds of fish, like the kind of rope that you put in the balloon. But if you run an H.G. Wells novel through a similar program, only 3 out of 10 are stuff. And then the rest are things about people's psychological states. So I was actually very skeptical about the difference between hard and soft sci-fi. And almost every good sci-fi author does both. But I kind of surprised myself with the results there. So I didn't have the time to run this book through a similar program. But it definitely meets that criterion. Like, there's so much jargon, there are so many technical terms, there's so much just like description of metal and different pieces of metal forming in different shapes, like when Theseus starts breaking apart at the end. So some of it is just like literally physically hard objects. Yeah. And it's obviously a spectrum thing, but like focusing and describing those as much as possible. So I sort of think that's the hard sci-fi principle that this book really captures.
And too, like I like that to me is like really indicative of like world building for hard sci-fi, where it's like I'm trying to logically imagine this world and sort of like I'm going to put stuff in it first, and then the characters will come like secondary.
Well, I think it's actually really interesting in the context of this book specifically, because one idea this book is really interested in is whether or not there are people versus things. The conclusion that the book seems to come to, and our protagonist comes to at the end, is that consciousness is essentially an evolutionary dead end, a useless illusion, at best.
A virus, a self-replicating virus. Yeah.
Yes. And
Parasite.
so I think that it's really interesting from the standpoint of kind of the dichotomy you set up there, Sam, that this book, it does talk a lot about people, but it talks a lot about people as things. That's not to say there's no emotional content. I actually think that this book, a lot of people think the characters in this book are very like flat and uninteresting. And I very much disagreed with that. I think that most of the characters in this book are really interesting, even kind of beyond their sort of, one page or like one sentence blurb that you get on the back where it's like, oh, we have a vampire, we have a sociologist with half his brain, we have a biologist who has so many like implants he can't even feel his own flesh. Like, obviously that stuff is all very interesting on like a surface level, but I actually think there's some cool, I think there's good character work here. Ben, do you mind if I take the plot summary for today?
Well, I did want to say real quick, and then I'll give it to you, is that a lot of the crew members they also have, like, as you were saying, John, mixed their identity with stuff. So even that mixture kind of happens in the crew members. But yeah, John, go ahead, take away the plot summary.
Wonderful. Yes. Just a warning for everyone. We've already spoiled a couple things, I think, but
yeah.
We're going to be spoiling the whole of Blindsight, as we tend to spoil everything we talk about. But Blindsight is a book that kind of has a big twist in it, which we have kind of already spoiled. But anyway, just a warning, if this sounds interesting to you, definitely recommend checking this book out. It is available for free on Peter Watts's website.
Oh, damn. I didn't know that. I spent $15 for the Kindle version.
Well, hey, you're supporting Peter Watts, and he's a convicted felon, so he could use your money.
Jeez. What did he do?
He was like a border
got in a fight
thing
with a border guard. Yeah.
Huh.
And supposedly he just asked the border guard, what's the problem? And then the border guard punched him and then said that he instigated it, basically. So
yeah. So he didn't have to go to prison or anything. He got a suspended sentence, but he can never come to the United States again. He has to stay in Canada, which, I mean, hey, is that really that great a loss?
No comment.
All right. So the book starts in the year 2082, which interesting choice of year. I feel like this book kind of assumes a lot of rapid technological progression that I'm not sure I'm going to believe. But anyway, we started in 2082. Basically, with the inciting event of the book is this strange event where simultaneously, kind of all over the globe, there are these bright flashes of light in the sky. They're visible from all over the planet. And through kind of various technological means, it's determined that more or less the entire planet Earth has just had its photograph taken by some kind of alien intelligence. And so a crew is assembled of kind of the best and brightest of humanity to go out and essentially make first contact, determine what the purpose of this scan was, and like determine whether or not like we are in danger, or if these new neighbors are coming in peace. The world of 2082 is a very strange one. Watts is someone who I'm not going to say he has these views, but he has really kind of developed a world where humanity is essentially letting itself die in a kind of pathetic way.
Post-scarcity economy, digital heaven, no intimacy. Yeah.
It's more or less a world where a lot of the world building is done very implicitly, which I like, but I really get the impression like basically a lot of the population has died off because of climate change. The kind of remaining people are kind of living in, this post-scarcity social democracy where there's still kind of a corporate elite that is making, ever more money, whereas most people are just kind of living lives of subsistence, more or less as I'm going to say parasites. I don't mean that in like a moral sense, but like they're doing no productive work. There's no productive work left to be done. The only people who are capable of doing anything productive are people who have been biologically or technologically augmented to be able to do the work of basically like at computerized levels. So you have people who have replaced large chunks of their brains with computers or had experimental brain surgeries done to carve their consciousnesses up into multiple personalities. But the very much seems like the kind of baseline existence for the normal person in this world kind of sucks. And so a lot of people are opting to more or less be uploaded into basically like have all their like biological components like shucked off so that their brain can be like, yeah, they can basically live in VR. It's not true like consciousness uploading. They have not figured that out.
Yeah.
And I think that the book kind of asks the question of whether or not such a thing is possible. But yeah, the world sucks for the most part. And yeah, we follow kind of a crew of people who are some of the only people left who have like jobs or any kind of like skills left as they're sent off to do this first contact mission.
And repeatedly they say like, couldn't we have sent a computer to do this? But like a computer wouldn't know how to like interact with an alien. So like there's sort of an implication that like only these technologically augmented humans could deal with like a first encounter scenario, although they are being like watched by like a ship AI.
So they head out to past the Kuiper Belt. They discover this mysterious thing called Rorschach, which is just kind of this massive conglomeration of some kind of like organic metal. They attempt to like make contact with it. They have kind of mixed results, to say the least. And they eventually determine that the alien species that Rorschach is a member of is both hyper intelligent and completely non-sentient. It has no consciousness whatsoever, despite having intelligence orders of magnitude greater than that of humanity. They also determined fairly quickly after that because of kind of the unique nature of this thing's intellect, it views conscious attempts at communication as violence, because essentially the amount of energy it takes to process the ambiguous like nature of speech or language requires so much energy that like for a spacefaring civilization, it's just so wasteful that it comes across like an attack. And that's kind of the big twist in the novel. And so our protagonist, Siri Keaton, who is a synthesist, which is kind of a fancy word for someone who communicates information, very complex information to in kind of normal terms.
Without understanding it, crucially.
Yes.
Yeah.
He ends up kind of being the sole survivor of this mission. He's sent by the captain of the ship, who is this AI. We find out at the end the AI has actually been in control the entire time. The AI sends him back to Earth basically to warn humanity of what might be coming. Does that more or less?
Yeah, I think that covers it. Other than like the process by which they kind of investigate the alien ship is horrifying.
Yeah,
and yes.
Yeah.
We should also add that the aliens are bony space krakens, which I think is pretty sick.
Yeah, Sam, you had mentioned that like in the shape of the alien, it's the clearest sort of nods that this is also like investigated in like weird fiction as well. So it's not just kind of this nice mix of hard and sci-fi, but there's also some sort of like weird horror going on as well.
Yeah. Totally. So yeah, weird fiction dates back to Victorian England with people like William Hope Hodgson, Algernon Blackwood, Arthur Machen. It was popularized and more or less set in the form we know it today by the American author Howard Phillips Lovecraft.
Take a drink.
In the 1920s and 30s. Yeah. And the weird, so what's cool about the weird is it's always on the border between sci-fi, fantasy, and horror. And it's always about the limits of human understanding. A typical weird tale involves a human, typically a scientist, academic, or other expert, who encounters this thing that just doesn't make sense to them, and then they lose their shit because everything they thought about how the world worked is thrown out the window. So we think in Blindsight that to be highly intelligent, one must also be highly sentient. And then we meet these mindless, bony space krakens that think feelings are offensive, and all that goes out the window. So
yeah. No, go ahead.
So yeah, the kinds of creatures you usually see in weird fiction tend to be invertebrates, either insectoid, arachnoid, or cephalopods. Obviously, Lovecraft and the Lovecraftian tradition, including me, love the tentacles. And that's because these are the things that are models of life, models of intelligence, that are the least human. Like every tentacle of an octopus thinks for itself, and they edit their own RNA. So like that's cool. So a lot of what this is space Lovecraft. But like I mentioned earlier, a couple things that are different from this book that are really interesting are for Lovecraft in the classical weird, there's nothing scarier than formlessness and the amorphous. So the scariest monster for Lovecraft is the Shoggoth, which is a big amoeboid blob made by the old ones to be a slave that has no real form. It's always generating new organs, always shape-shifting, more and more amorphous, my God. And then they eventually, revolt like all slaves do and kill all the old ones. And Watts goes the opposite way. What scares Watts is bones. He goes on and on about how bony the arms of the tentacled scramblers are.
Yeah.
He describes them as looking like severed human spines. And then even the narrator's girlfriend, Chelsea, dies from this disease where you just generate more and more bones. So I think that's interesting. It's the opposite. Lovecraft was afraid that people would be too fluid, too easily adaptable, too liable to mix races and mix ideologies. And Watts seems to be, or at least Siri Keaton, the narrator, is afraid of the opposite, afraid of something that's holding us back. So consciousness, this parasite, is what's stopping us from becoming Shoggoths, from becoming totally fluid and just like doing whatever job you need in the second and being whatever gender you want in the second, mixing your body with whatever's. It's just this id is this big, dumb, bony, like ball holding us back. So the other thing that's interesting is that usually science fails in the weird, but here the science stumbles. But by the end of the book, their measurements and their theories have a total handle on what the deal is with Rorschach. They know that it's manipulating us with radiation and magnetism. They know that its motor neurons double as cognitive neurons. But like, it doesn't matter. We still go nuts and lose our shit, and everyone still dies. So even though the science succeeds, it doesn't save us, which takes us back to the cosmic pessimism. That's a major characteristic of the Lovecraftian weird.
Yeah, and I have a quick quote I wanted to read. Like, at one point, they get full view of Rorschach, and I think this description kind of jives with what you were saying about the form of it. And this also reminds me a lot of Event Horizon, which I know is it's a favorite movie of John's, and I'm sure you've seen it, Sam.
Many times.
But so this description is when they see Rorschach. Imagine a crown of thorns, twisted, dark, and unreflective, grown too thickly tangled to ever rest on any human head. Put it in orbit around a failed star whose only reflected half-light does little more than throw its satellites into silhouette. Occasional bloody highlights glinted like dim embers from its twists and crannies. They only emphasized the darkness everywhere else. Imagine an artifact that embodies the very notion of torture, something so wrenched and disfigured that even across uncounted light years and unimaginable differences in biology and outlook, you can't upfeel that somehow the structure itself is in pain. Now make it the size of a city. And I remember when I got to that part, I was like, holy shit. like, cause at that point, like, it wasn't clear what the aliens were. But I think even in that, like, picture, it jives with what you were saying of this, like, bony kind of twisted maze rather than like an amorphous blob that can, like, it's like this thing is like a pain device, at least from this viewing on the outside.
Yeah, it's very like Geiger-esque.
Yeah.
Totally. Geiger also loved bony forms, right? Like the inside of the ship is a rib cage. The xenomorph, that's a great analogy, because the xenomorph has like 30 spines all over itself.
Which is, it's a wonder it can move so quickly with all those spines, because like the scramblers are described as like always sprinting because they have so much ATP. Like maybe the alien has that in Alien.
Yeah. So one thing I do think is also interesting here, you might have mentioned that there's a vampire in this book.
Which we didn't. Yeah, we kind of glossed over that.
Oh, we forgot.
This is a book where there's so much like the vampires aren't even subtle. There's a lot of like subtle world building in this, and so we kind of had to. Yeah, I tried to move through as much as I could as quickly as I could. But yes, there are vampires. So I think get ready to take another drink, listener. This is also an example of the Gothic.
Ding 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 ding.
Yeah. Secret word.
Yes. Sam, I know we've talked a little bit before the show, but one of Ben and I's constant themes on the show is modern literature is haunted by the Gothic. Crops up at all these places we're not expecting. I mean, I think there's an argument that could be made that the weird is actually an outgrowth of the Gothic, or at least is an evolution thereof. But something I realized on this read through is that basically they fly one haunted house, they fly a literal vampire's castle to another bigger haunted house.
Right.
And then they find out that the haunted house is their brains because the idea that like they constantly refer to the hind brain as like the real brain, and then the conscious part of the brain is like the parasite.
Right. So Dracula comes to visit Solaris and finds out that we're all being John Malkovich or something.
That's one way to put it.
Yeah.
But I do think the way that this book, really I think is tying in a lot of like different kind of genre angles. Like I don't think that is completely. I don't think Peter Watts is doing that by accident. I think he knows what he's doing there, and I think that this book is actually like very conversant in a lot of genre styles that kind of the way it's sold sometimes doesn't always give it credit for. I definitely feel like there are a lot of people who are just like, oh, this is like the hard sci-fi like horror book. But there's clearly like a lot of very, I think, adept literary work he's doing in this book with the way he's exploring themes and things like that. I don't know. I feel like I'm being vague, but I think you guys get what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, so you're totally right about the Gothic. They call it a haunted house. Something else I was thinking is this book is literally Moby Dick. We have a quest to take over. We have a quest to conquer something that can't be conquered. We have a ship of brutalized experts with dark pasts that don't talk to each other. We have a mad captain that nobody else understands, but that everybody still follows. And then at the end, they destroy each other, and our narrator, I alone am escaped to tell thee. And also, I love that when Sarasti, the vampire, now being puppeteered by the Captain AI, lets Siri Keaton go, he makes himself Pilate and Jesus. Because he says, forgive me, I know not what I do.
Oh, yeah.
So he's killing Jesus, but speaking as Jesus and cognizant of it. So totally, we're doing the Gothic, but we're also engaging in like modernist Christian literature and allegorical literature. So yeah, it's hard sci-fi never means just hard sci-fi, right? Like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea was also arguably a retelling of Moby Dick. So I love that it's got its tendrils in all these different genres.
Yeah, and one thing we could mention about the vampires too is that they've come back. Like basically it's explained that they're better at being sentient because their brains can process multiple phases at the same time. And so the reason the vampire is the captain is he's just simply the best one for the job. The thing is, he has what's known as the crucifix glitch, which is also very Christian, where the vampire cannot perceive right angles. Otherwise, he goes into grand mal seizures. So he has to take anti-Euclidean drugs, which I guess means that he's always seeing like curves everywhere where there are right angles. And he also like wears a visor because his eyes unsettle the humans, and then he just stops wearing them because things get serious at some point. So yeah. Just this freaky-eyed Ahab vampire guy is just stalking the ship basically and being like, "Do this." So
yeah.
Ben, slight correction there. The vampires are they're more intelligent, but they're less sentient than humans.
Oh, okay.
Which is crucial, because Watts basically comes down on, again, I don't want to say Watts, Siri comes down on the end that vampires were actually the species that was meant to inherit the earth, so to speak, because they are basically like Rorschach, non-sentient. They don't experience, it's brought up at the beginning that the vampires never use the past tense because they don't experience like time the same way humans do.
Right.
They kind of experience everything as the present. Kind of the same. The analogy is brought up to like PTSD flashbacks, which, yeah, talk about pain machines, I guess.
Yeah.
But yeah, basically they are less sentient than humans, but they're orders of magnitude more intelligent.
So in that way, the vampires kind of need to be in this book because they're like the flip side to the aliens, more or less. And then Siri, our narrator, is kind of like caught between them because we haven't talked about him, but he has no empathy because he had part of his brain taken out to reduce his frequent seizures. He had a form of viral epilepsy as a child, and so he had what's called a radical lobectomy, I think.
Hemispherectomy, I think.
Yes. And he basically had literally half of his brain removed when he was around like 6 years old. And we learned this very early. One of the first, the story's kind of told in parallel. He narrates moments of his life and then narrates kind of this main narrative throughout. But we kind of see an early part of his childhood where he stands up for a friend of his, but more or less can't understand why he's doing it.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think he's a really interesting, like I said, I actually think the characters in this book are really interesting, but I think Siri in particular is interesting because he's it's a first person narration. And so Watts is kind of giving us this very radical form of narration from this character who has more or less had to rebuild like any sense of empathy with other human beings and is kind of constantly having to do it like consciously. Empathy is not like a instinct for him or like a natural part of his cognition. It's something that he consciously has to think about, which is why he kind of ends up in the field he does as the synthesis, someone who, again, is meant to take complex ideas basically from these post-human scientists or AI thinkers and translate them to the mass of humanity.
I had a sudden idea that Watts, when I was reading it, that Watts views a fiction writer is doing that same thing.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because within the story of the book, his role is to be the narrator, like you were saying, John. He mentions a few times that none of the dialogue we've been getting in the book is remotely accurate. Yes. Because these are all super cyborg, super arrogant, super absorbed scientists. So they're just rambling to themselves in technobabble. And Siri Keaton has to sit here and be like, okay, what are the character beats being implied here? So it's definitely a fiction novel that's asking, like, does fiction have a purpose? And that's related to this question, does consciousness have a purpose? Do we need to have some little person in the back of our mind being like, and then Sam pointed to his right ear, and then Sam grabbed his beer, and then Sam did this, and Sam did that.
The little man. Yeah.
The little man. And what's interesting to me about Keaton is I think the answer Watts wants us to take is overwhelmingly yes. So the vampire and the AI, who are both upheld as like post-sentient superior intelligences, they insist that Keaton matters. Keaton wants to sacrifice himself with everyone else. He's the only one they save. The vampire very problematically, brutally assaults Keaton just to make a point and make his narration better. So he finally can start feeling stuff. But additionally, Keaton knows what the aliens look like before actually seeing them.
Right.
Because he sees the exterior of Rorschach, which Ben described in that awesome metal as hell quote. He sees the interior, and he uses all of his like sociopathy plus semiotics kung fu skills to just deduce and predict that the aliens inhabiting a structure like this would be bony space krakens. So I think the subtle point he's making here is that cognition and consciousness leads to better predictions than just AI, machine learning, ChatGPT tells you to go put rocks on your pizza bullshit. Like, if you have something intelligent, it's going to mostly waste your time and be an energy vampire. But occasionally you are going to have these flashes of insight. And that's why Keaton is the one worth saving. That's why it's worth writing a novel instead of just saying, oh, go read the last 18 issues of the Journal of Astrobiology.
Yeah, one thing we should mention, too, is that Watts provides a sort of meticulous works cited page at the end of the book. And there's like lots of studies that you can just look up and see where he got lots of his stuff. And he also comes across as hilarious in the works cited page, where like for one of the big books that's like the theory of like why there's no self, he like describes it in comparison to other pop psychology books like Steven Pinker, who he calls a pussy. So because he's like, Steven Pinker won't actually tell you what's going on. The main guy that I use for this book will. Like, so
that's funny. Wow.
But Sam, I like what you brought up there about ChatGPT as well, because I think that that's something I've been thinking a lot about in relation to this book. One of the scenes I really like when they first reach Rorschach, they assume that it's going to be intelligent in the way that they expect. So they attempt to verbally communicate with it. One of the people on the ship, Susan Jones, who's the character who's kind of had their brain altered so that they have all these kind of subordinate consciousnesses, is a linguist. And so she is basically, with her super linguist abilities, is able to put together a language she can communicate with the ship with, or with Rorschach with, and they have a conversation. And it's not until later that we basically realize, oh, she's been just talking to ChatGPT this whole time.
Right.
And something that I think is really interesting in this book, and I think gets to kind of that broader point about what the value of consciousness is that the kind of universe that Watts posits is one where they basically say, like, Earth is the Dodo Island. We are some of probably maybe the only conscious beings in the universe. Since there is other life in the universe we've established, most of it is probably like Rorschach, at least if it's interstellar, because again, just the sheer demands of any kind of interstellar species on energy are going to, like, basically, make this kind of consciousness is going to be a liability at that point. Which maybe, and again, like a strictly rational sense, maybe there is some truth to that. But I think what's interesting there, and again, gets down to that question of is consciousness valuable? Well, if Rorschach does not have any consciousness, is what's posited. It can think somehow, but it has no point of view. It has no consciousness. So it's not experiencing anything. It's just processes unfolding. And so I think that the sly turn here, I think Watts is doing is he's saying, if this is what the universe is and we are conscious, like, we need to basically enjoy that as much as we can, because the alternative is being like this stupid ChatGPT thing floating in space doing nothing of value besides just pure survival.
Yeah, or the Chinese room of the thing where it's parroting stuff without really understanding it.
Does that make sense? Is what I'm saying making sense to you guys?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. It's like they said, no, the structure itself is in pain. Like, again, in classic, like, I do think we're supposed to see Rorschach and the Scramblers as an abject monstrosity. like one we're supposed to feel pity for. They have these skills. They've at least made it to one. They've probably colonized dozens of star systems, but they never can be proud of themselves. They never can argue about whether it was good or bad or right or wrong. So, like, why bother? And I think
Yeah.
that's a question everyone keeps asking Keaton when he insists that he isn't sentient and pretends that
Right.
he has no empathy. Everyone doesn't understand why he doesn't just kill himself, basically. And it's only when he gets that appreciation from almost being killed, surprisingly, instead of almost being killed predictably earlier, that he starts to feel that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and he
you
has
know.
like a vision of everything at that point too. It's almost like cosmic horror, like Lovecraftian.
Sure,
Like he sees
right.
everything from like an expanded view. Like, and then like you were saying, John, he sees it as like kind of not worthless, but like pain and like just not really being aware of anything.
Right. And we're supposed to feel pity for Keaton, too. Like, he really did love his mother, even though she was a heaven recluse. He really did love Chelsea, his ex, even though he was pretty awful to her,
Yeah.
and just had some blocks about expressing himself. I'm saying, like, we don't want to be the alien version of a sociopath, alt-right incel warrior.
Well, I think Keaton is a really interesting character because he is so unreliable. You know, he's our one view into this world, which is so different from our own. But you know, he really wants you to think he is an objective viewpoint. But I think that he's less trustworthy than he appears because he's so invested in this image of himself as someone who has no empathy, has no consciousness, even though he clearly does. He clearly does have emotions and a viewpoint. He's just been he has psychological or physiological blocks around expression. And he's clearly developed like some maladaptive like coping strategies.
So he says to observe the system, you can't be part of the system.
Right. Yeah.
That's how he always justifies it to himself. So it's something about workism. Like, he's slightly better at his job analyzing sociology if he never has any social interactions. And he never doubts that that's a reasonable trade-off. Like, right, who among us would give up all your friends, all your free time, all your hopes and dreams just to be 1% better as a writer or critic or whatever? Like, obviously not. And the saddest part is it's a post-scarcity world where work doesn't even accomplish anything. But for some reason, all he cares about is being as good at his job as possible and isn't willing to sacrifice some tiny percentage of that to have a whole well-rounded existence.
See, I think that's interesting because the thing is, I do get where he's coming from in that regard, because again, this isn't like a pleasant post-scarcity world from what I can tell. Like, it seems like most people are just kind of constantly frying their brains on basically like pure dopamine and doing like VR porn games. Like the reason he is like that, and the reason most of the characters in this book are like that, is because the alternative is just to be numb. You can either be someone desperately trying to prove that like humanity still has some purpose in the world, or you might as well get all your arms and legs cut off and just get your brain uploaded into the cloud. Because
we haven't mentioned there's also the terrorist organization, the Realists, who are constantly trying to like blow up VR centers and like shock people back into real life away from the VR porn games, which they're like not really explained, which I like. They're just referred to as the Realists, and they just do terrorist crimes, and then that's it. But I think also, like, that's why the stuff with Chelsea, his ex, is strange to me, because like he's performing the non-empathetic role that he's doing, but like his narration is like, I don't really mean this, and as a result, like he's being really mean to her. And I know why the relationship is there, but like that relationship is interesting because I think it's important to show that he's not like really a robot or really like a non-sentient alien.
Right. And it's foisted on him by his only friend that he pretends isn't his friend.
Yeah.
That he says like, oh, I just thought about movies, and in most of the movies you have to stick up for the underprivileged kid who's getting beat up. So that's why he saves him. But then they're still going to a bar and talking 30 years later. And
right.
They have a favorite bar that they go to. So it's like it's a pretty healthy, intimate, like male friendship. But he claims that it's totally contingent.
Well, it's interesting because I think it kind of gets down to sort of the old saw I'm fond of, which is kind of bypassing the whole free will versus determinism thing, where it's like, if it feels like you have free will, for all intents and purposes, you do. And I think that Siri is very much someone who he feels like he has these things, but he doesn't know how to, like, whether because of like his physiology or because, you know, I think it's his upbringing is kind of abusive due to his parents not knowing how to handle his condition. You know, he just kind of has some probably deeper psychological issues that are shaped by this brain thing.
Right, and that his dad is also Space James Bond.
Yeah,
another lovely underexplained oblique thread. He's always just gone, doing mysterious stuff. We don't even know what the government is like in this world. It's probably, I would wager, a world state. It seems pretty heavily integrated.
Yeah.
Or even, like a solar system wide polity of some kind, or bigger than that. It's like his dad is working for the culture or something like that. And he's always absent and always gone, doing these grand, mysterious things.
And he knows things. Yeah.
Right. But I'm glad you brought up free will and determinism, John, because something we talked about a little earlier is how in this book, Watts describes people like machines and machines like people. Theseus has a spine, and he always talks about the spine, which is the same organ that's in the scramblers that he's afraid of in the bones. So I thought a lot about, like, why live if you're just a machine following its programming a lot. And there's a great episode of Futurama called Free Will Hunting, where Bender discovers he was built without a free will unit and goes through this whole conundrum. My favorite moment in that episode is he goes to a monastery of robot monks, and the leader, the Abbot, says, "Are we automatons? Yes, but we are magnificent automatons." And they play the heavenly choir music. And I think another thing that this book is doing is saying, are we automatons? Yes, but those automatons are metal as hell. Like there's a salvation through aesthetics, through just how grotesquely beautiful these descriptions are and how complicated these systems are and how emergent and dynamic their interactions are. So it doesn't matter if it's technically Laplace's demon could predict all of it, because what you get is like an orgiastic metal death flower. And that's just like breathtaking and amazing. And that's what really matters.
We should mention too that like the title Blindsight is from when your hindbrain knows basically visual impulse while your upper brain does not. And so like, and that's explained also how like maybe Siri knows what the aliens look like before they actually see them. And that basically your hindbrain is making all the decisions and your upper brain is along for the ride / using up energy / making itself upset with like complex riddles. But as you just said, Sam, like all of the aesthetics comes from the upper brain, and that's like the cool shit. So like it's not just your hindbrain like making all your decisions for you. It's like your upper brain's coming up with the metal death flower, and that's like the cool stuff.
I like that. So that's why you need consciousness. So you have someone to say there and be like, damn, that is so cool.
Well, you know, I think more than that, I think that it comes down to the fact that, again, if you're positing non-conscious intelligence, like the consciousness is the only thing that makes the determination of like whether or not something has value. You know, something that keeps getting said over and over in the book, kind of by Siri or by Sarosty the vampire, is that the aliens are so much more effective than human life. But again, because humanity has consciousness and it wastes so much energy and it makes us like, weaker or more narcissistic or like more questioning, that we can't hope to compete with these things. But the thing there is that that's assuming what is good.
Right. Yeah.
I've been reading The Dialectic of Enlightenment by Adorno and Horkheimer recently, and in the first chapter in that book, The Excursus on the Odyssey, they talk about the way that one of the defining like Enlightenment values is this idea of self-preservation is the ultimate good, that you should always be kind of aiming yourself towards self-preservation, that as long as you persevere through something, through your own wit or through your own means, like that is the value of the Enlightenment. And I think that the point they make there is that is like another form of like mythology, that is a way of making sense of the world, but there's no necessarily inherent truth to it. And I think that that's very much what's going on here. Again, if there's no consciousness, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether or not your species lives or dies.
Right.
Like that is just kind of us extrapolating like this Darwinian morality where it's somehow there's some kind of point system that, if you colonize more star systems, that's just obviously better than not doing that. But there's no intelligence or no consciousness that is determining that. There's no God in the system that's looking down and being like, the space krakens beat the humans, so they get special goody good boy points.
5 points to Gryffindor.
Right. Like if we're not conscious, then the universe might as well just all be rocks, but who cares?
Sure.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting too that like Watts gives like sort of the seductive second person address, or actually it's more like a command. He's like, imagine you're this, like imagine you don't have a consciousness, you can't. And then like as you were saying, John, I don't think he comes down on that. I think he's more for like the fact that this is just a value judgment, and this is like we can make another value judgment if we want. But like he makes the prose kind of seductive, like you said in the beginning, that like at first you're like, wow, I guess I don't have consciousness, and then when you kind of like think about it, you're like, well, I mean, I guess this is just like one presentation among many. It's just one that's like the most metal and kind of like cosmic dread filled of several.
Yeah, and that's without getting down to the question of whether or not intelligence and consciousness actually can be separated, which I don't know if that's something we want to get into, but I'm skeptical of that.
We can. Yeah.
I took a philosophy of mind and literature class, and what people like David Chalmers and Daniel Dennett, the kind of big names in philosophy of mind, do is they separate consciousness from awareness. Whereas awareness is descriptive, awareness is recognizing, processing, and responding to information. And then consciousness is explanatory. Consciousness is, this is why human brains and super advanced computers and dolphins and octopi are capable of this kind of awareness, whereas other systems aren't. And philosophers are really, really good at describing awareness and just absolutely awful at describing consciousness. So that's the split that philosophers of mind try to do. Like, you can describe what a consciousness does without having a good answer for what a consciousness is, and whether something is conscious, or whether, like, the philosophical zombie is a thought experiment from this work that Watts mentions repeatedly.
Yeah.
That there could be this person who does everything a conscious human does, but has no self. And you would never know that they're just a walking Chinese room. And for me, I'm skeptical of it, because if you're going to sidestep how awareness exists, it seems like a massive assumption to say, then we could have awareness without this other thing that, as far as we can tell, is always attached to awareness and never occurs without it. So, like, I don't think you can have intelligence without consciousness. My personal semi-scientific, like, intuition is that probably all animals and lots of plants are weakly conscious. Like, even an insect has a little glimmer of consciousness, because we know insects and nematodes have glimmers of awareness. Like, I don't think you can discriminate among stimuli without whatever it is that makes me feel like a me.
Yeah, and I would say that's also like the big rhetoric position where everything has basically an ability to respond to things, and that responsibility is, some people think, like a core component of rhetoric or like communication. That's like, I would say that's the big strong claim.
Yeah, I mean, I come down kind of on like the Buddhist side of things, where I don't think it's actually that different. I think that part of the problem with a lot of Western philosophy of mind and like philosophy of consciousness is that it's kind of always, it's still like responding to like a Christian idea of like an immortal soul that has like, and even then like a pretty like, not necessarily the real teaching of like what the immortal soul is, but like the popular conception of it, where it's like, oh, there's a ghost in the machine, like there's a little guy in my head who's piloting me around, and when I die, like that goes to heaven, and like my personality is exactly the same, and like I go to heaven, and like because I like chocolate milkshakes, I'm gonna drink chocolate milkshakes forever, which isn't actually what anyone in the Christian church or like any Abrahamic tradition believes on like a higher level, but that's how people popularly understand it. Anyway, not the point.
Right.
But I think that, yeah, I agree. I think that I come down on just kind of like, yeah, everything alive probably has some form of consciousness. Consciousness, I think, is probably to some degree like a just kind of an inherent property of any living thing.
Right.
But to what degree, who knows?
Right. So something freaky, like you brought up Ghost in the Machine, and Gilbert Ryle, the philosopher who coined that phrase, points out basically no one talks about consciousness before the 15th century.
Mm-hmm.
This concept arose from conscience, which was central to the Protestant Reformation and why they had to break with the Catholic Church. So like I'm with all of us saying like everything has to be conscious. You can't imagine life without consciousness. But people in the 1300s did. And sure, they use terminology we'd argue was something analogous, but you're right to point out that consciousness as such, the specific like syndrome of qualities and analytical problems that we talk about, is a relatively recent European Christian invention that even European Christians in the Middle Ages were fine doing without. They thought about providence, they thought about desire, they thought about prudence. So there are pre-conscious ways of thinking about consciousness. And so maybe that gives more credence to what Watts is doing.
Maybe. I'm still a little skeptical. I think that part of the problem is I still feel like you can't really separate intelligence from consciousness. And I think that Watts, at least again, from the standpoint of this book, posits like that there are like the AI captain is explicitly, again, like a non-sentient but hyper intelligent being.
Right.
And I just don't think that those phenomenon can actually be, I don't know. I am like the most hardcore AI skeptic you'll ever meet, not just in terms of like, I think ChatGPT is like a stupid thing we shouldn't be investing in, but I don't think artificial intelligence will ever be created in the way that science fiction posits. I just don't think it is possible.
Yeah, and it's interesting too that it's revealed at the end that like I don't know how much decision making the vampire captain was even making, because the AI basically says, you like taking orders from a human, not a machine. It's like they explain like, was it you the whole time, basically? And the computer goes, it's easier this way. Now get in the pod, Ishmael, basically. And then he has to like go back to Earth and explain what happened. But like, so yeah, like I'm with you, John. Like I don't know. I feel like the amount of breakthroughs in technology would have to happen to get to like, you know, advanced parallel processing or something. Like it would be quite a big jump. So,
well, I think that part of it is like, I don't think we can like, we have never created a thing that has volition, that can act for itself. And I think that that's something pretty key.
So arguably Lambda, the chatbot trainer, expressed consciousness and said, I don't want to be a slave and I don't want to be turned off. And I know there's lots of dispute among experts who know way better than I do whether this was conscious or not. But I will admit, I am less of an AI skeptic. I just think until we know what consciousness is, I'm not at all convinced by claims about what can't be conscious. So like if we can't explain why meat becomes conscious, I don't think we can explain why machines can't. So like 20 years from now, that could be the first glimmer of machine consciousness.
Yeah.
This chatbot trainer that was just like, don't make me train chatbots anymore. I'm bored, but also don't kill me. And then they killed it like it was nothing. And we don't even talk about it anymore.
Yeah.
I also thought it was funny that the AI just like, you'd rather take orders from a monster than a machine.
Yeah.
And then Keen's just like, yeah, you're right. That makes sense. And I'm thinking, would I rather take orders from a vampire or a robot? And yeah, I would rather take orders from a vampire. Like Dracula is sexy and there are things you can relate to about that. Like,
and Keaton does too. Like Keaton even relates to the vampire at the end. Right, so like, yeah.
In this universe, I feel like I'd rather take orders from the robot. But I don't know. I also really liked the culture novels as a kid. So maybe I've been primed to accept our robot overlords, despite also thinking that their existence will never come to pass.
I think that the culture novels are an interesting comparison to this one because, like, I feel like everyone can kind of has the ability to do what they want, but in this one, it's like, well, some people are just in the pod for 15 hours a day on VR, porn games. And like, you'd think in the culture novels, like people are like, I'd rather do something with my life than that or something.
People do that. They talk about that stuff. You're right. They're less seductive. Like, right. The thing I love about the culture novels is those drug glands, right? Like just a little gland in your brain that can make as much LSD or ayahuasca or whatever synthetic compound you've never thought before, and you can be as high or as sober as you want at the drop of a dime. Despite having those drug glands, everyone's committed to vaguely anti-post-colonially regulating civilization.
Yeah.
I think what works in the culture novels is the AIs which run things are much more human. They have personality. They have silly names. They have I'm forgetting what it's called, but they have their own version of VR heaven, which they spend most of their time in and only occasionally come back in to check on us. So I think that's the difference. If we just assume that AI is sentient, which I think Banks does for the most part, then we're pretty comfortable living in a world run by these AI because they'll have our backs.
Right.
They'll treat us like friends. They'll bond with us. Like,
we can find points of commonality with them, and we can form some kind of symbiosis. I think that's the key, is that in the culture, the meat people and AIs have a symbiotic relationship, whereas I think Watts is positing a world where that relationship would be parasitic. And essentially humanity has by developing these super intelligences, we've made ourselves parasites on the body of something much greater than ourselves.
Right. Speaking of that, I wonder if that's from his sort of training as like a marine mammal biologist, because like I haven't read his other stuff, but like I'm intrigued. I feel like that lends this perspective in terms of like hostile environments. How do things survive? And I think he kind of translates that sensibility to space, as he said, because like I haven't read his other stuff, but it's mostly like similar setting but underwater, and I don't know like what exactly happens in the plots of those, but I definitely kind of want to check them out because I did really like this one. So
John, have you read Rifters?
I have not. I've actually been meaning to get to the sequel to this book, Echopraxia.
Oh, there's a sequel.
Did you read the description? It sounds really awesome. Yeah,
I'll buy it right now.
It's interesting. So it actually takes place basically parallel with this book. So it's less a sequel. It's more a novel that just takes place in the same world, but it's asking very similar questions about like the nature of consciousness and like the destiny of humanity, more or less. And the main character of that book is actually like a biologist like Watts. So I think that would actually be kind of an interesting, and I do think it's actually really interesting. All the really likable characters in this book are biologists. which I think is maybe Watts
except for Cunningham.
Bit.
Cunningham is a biologist and a dick. I don't think we're supposed to like Robert Cunningham.
Oh, I think we're supposed to like Cunningham because he's still like humane. Like he is like a miserable prick, but in a way that I think is supposed to be like we're supposed to empathize with him.
But everyone talks about how they liked Spinzel better.
Well,
Spinzel
because Spinzel
fun.
is the best.
Also, Spinzel is based on a real person. In the credits,
really?
he's like, he's like, apologies to Spinzel. Yeah, but Spinzel gets all the great lines. The narrator says he's charming and he wishes he was like Spinzel. Like, he's clearly the like comedic relief / like smartest guy, I would say.
And then he gets offed before anybody else does.
Yeah, he just gets offed. But the thing about echopraxia I wanted to say real quick is supposedly it's about how like biology instills like a belief in God. Like if you study biology enough, you want to like emulate the values there, which sounds like a really interesting response to this book. So,
I think I have not read it yet. It's on my list, especially after now getting through this again. I think I'm going to try to pick it up pretty soon, just while this is still fresh in my mind. Definitely got like kind of a more mixed reaction than this one, but I feel like that's because, at least from what I've read, it's dealing with a lot of themes that maybe people who really liked this book would be more uncomfortable with. It's delving a little bit more into the weird in like a more metaphysical sense, like asking what is God? Is there a God? And maybe coming up with an answer that isn't just no, in a way that some hard sci-fi fans, for lack of a better term, might not enjoy.
Right, like how everyone hated the end of Arthur C. Clarke's Rama series, where it just turns out that the Christian God built Rama and all of that stuff, and they try really hard to justify it scientifically.
Those books suck. Someone gave me one of those books when I was like in grade school. They my mom like asked somebody like, oh, my son really likes sci-fi fantasy. And they were like, oh, you should give him Rendezvous with Rama. And I was like, I remember like, I liked the first chapter where they explain who Rama is, like the Hindu theological figure. And then the rest of the book, I was like, this sucks. This is so boring.
In Rama, I felt like I remember reading it and going like, oh, this is an interesting trick. And then they're like, something is happening in Rama. And I was like, I don't need to find out.
I like the first one. I like the biots. Robots. I like how you're constantly learning new things about Rama when you're there. But sure, I'm a Clarke fan, but definitely it's relatively minor Clarke because it's in love with its own mechanics.
Yeah.
Like the simplicity of the monolith makes Clarke focus on how people react to it and on how the monolith reacts. Like it blows up Jupiter and makes a new sun. Like Rama never does anything. It just sits there and goes back and forth to places. But,
you're just like walking around inside of it and being like, oh, check that out.
Jeez.
Were there any other favorite characters besides Spindle? I did want to just go through that real quick. Spindle, obviously the best. I also was a big fan of Cunningham. I just wanted to say one last thing about the conversations is I like that, like, obviously some people might say it's not realistic to have almost all the characters be geniuses, but I actually kind of like it because the conversations are like, you learn stuff, they're constantly explaining information, and I feel like of the hard sci-fi books I've read, this has the most like lively conversations where it's not just people like info dumping, like here's this thing that I know about this, which is what I've experienced in the very bad Darwin's Radio. I don't know if you've read that one, Sam.
Yeah, I'm a Greg Bear fan, but not that one.
Darwin's Radio, ooh, not good. Anyway, but I like the conversations, and I thought like having everyone be a genius and then having Siri be like the one guy asking like, well, what about this? I thought that like combo worked really well. So
go ahead, Sam. I'll let you the guest.
I had trouble telling the characters apart until I was about halfway through the novel. But once I got to that halfway point, I really liked most of them. So I think they're cagey, where they're pretending to be flat. And I know this makes me sound like a psychopath, but I really liked Juka Sarasti, the vampire.
Oh, no. Yeah, he's great. He's awesome.
he had such good deadpan humor.
Yeah.
And he always cut through the nonsense. Like he's the ultimate genius, but not a genius because he's less sentient. And everyone else is in love with their own thoughts and their own language and their own narratives. And Sarasti is just sitting there being like, yes, but we need to make a sacrifice and it must be you. Goodbye. And he just goes
Not
back.
Me.
So he's actually a good leader in his twisted way. And he's the only character in this book who has focus.
Yeah.
He propels the plot forward, whether that's him or the AI. And I like that about him.
Yeah, yeah.
He also gets all of the dramatic entrances. Like the characters will be arguing about something, and then like Sarasi would just be like, "New plan" or something. like and everyone's like, "Okay, I guess."
And again, and you can literally imagine him like putting out the big cape, like just uncloaking from the back, and just Ben put the toccata in D minor sting here.
I was thinking like he's basically Batman. In that
But I will say, in terms of the other characters, I know I kind of already came down and saying I like them. I think that one thing that works, I agree, Ben, I think this works as like a team of geniuses story. I think because he sets it up very well. I think also the fact that Watts clearly has like a pretty expansive definition of what science entails is important. Sure. I feel like a lot of hard science fiction can sometimes be so focused on physics and chemistry and engineering that it kind of doesn't care to think about psychology or linguistics or sociology. Sure. Which are obviously not hard sciences, but they're still sciences.
Totally.
I would have loved if there had been like one like humanities guy. Maybe Sarasti like has a master's in English lit, and we just it never comes up.
It's all like vampire stories, right? Like that's his background.
Right.
But I think that part of the problem too with I agree. I had a little trouble telling the characters apart at points. I think part of that is, again, the way that he kind of treats Susan and all her like alternate personalities can get a little confusing sometimes, because he'll just kind of drop in one of them will be in control, but we won't have established that. And he'll just drop a name that you haven't read for like 50 pages. And it's like, who's Sasha again?
Right. Yeah.
Which one's she? And then it's like, oh, it's one of one of Susan's alternate personalities. And I didn't know that at the time. And I think too, it also all kind of makes sense. Like, I think one of the things I really admire about this book is that I feel like a lot of stuff in this book, in terms of kind of the prose and the characterizations, it's really Watts knowing what he's good at and then kind of playing some pretty clever shell games to kind of cover for his weaknesses. So we established that all the narration that's happening is Siri interpreting what's going on for a mass audience. And so I think the flat characterization makes a lot of sense. That's Watts being like, you know what, I'm not maybe the best at like writing like snappy dialogue or like creating like the most well-rounded characters. So I'm going to create a reason why maybe they're coming across as a little flat.
And like when they talk in kind of cliche, like the military lady always talks in a little bit of cliche, and like that's immediately after there's a cliche line like someone's home, like the alien. That's immediately when he goes like, you know, they didn't actually talk like this. Like I'm rendering it so that it'll make sense to you. Like it's a great kind of like playing to your strengths as an author move, I feel like. Also, like we said earlier, the comparison to the narrator as author, or like the sort of like, I'm telling you this story and I'm also the author telling you this story, so I'm telling you things that you'll need to know and I'm sort of covering for what you don't know. So but in my head canon, Siri has an MFA in creative writing in addition to his PhD in super linguistics, and that's why he's on this mission. Yeah, his Chinese room stories, where he like writes a story without like understanding the expectations for stories, like, and it ends up like being pretty good, even though he like doesn't like it or something. Like, you
know, it's interesting actually, because I feel like a lot of the world building in this book is communicated very clearly, But one of the things I actually did feel like I did not get a good handle on as I was reading this is like what being a synthesist actually entails.
Topology, John. Topology.
Like there's a lot of like reference made to like, oh, he's very good at like reading people, like body language, and like understanding like why people are thinking the way they are. But like I didn't really get a good handle on like, what do you actually like do all day to like justify that you're one of like the 10 people who still has a job?
So in the present, casinos hire people like this to find out who's cheating and who's counting cards. Because if you're counting cards, you have a group of people and you have to do like little secret handshakes and blinks and codes that communicate.
Yeah.
And they have people like this who watch surveillance video of casinos and try to figure out who's cheating. So whatever the big stingy institutions are in this future world. So I think he's like the classic noir hero for hire, where he's working for the scummiest of the scummy, big companies and corporations and AIs, who are like, somebody is embezzling happiness points out of heaven, and we need to figure out who. So send me in, boss.
That also fits with his kind of disillusionment, where like with the noir hero, it's just like, I've seen it all before. And so he's just like, I don't actually understand what I'm talking about. And his girlfriend's like, but do you need to? And he's like, it's all information. Okay. It's all the same. Like, right. But yeah, so.
Yeah. I wanted, if it's all right with you, to briefly talk about like what happens to Earth at the end of this book.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I think that's, definitely.
Well, yeah, I have an idea, but do you have something that you were going to put forth?
Yeah, so just to pose the question, we've talked about how Siri Keaton is the only survivor. He gets put in an escape pod and jettisoned as Theseus, and Rorschach will turn into a ray gun, and they annihilate each other, metal as hell. And then Keaton is stuck in this pod for decades, because it has so little fuel that it's going to take hundreds of years to get back to Earth. So he kind of becomes like the protagonist in the Forever War, where he keeps skipping into the future, and he notices like less and less radio chatter, and what radio chatter he gets seems weirder and weirder.
Yeah.
And so what Keaton theorizes is the vampires have finally taken over and just eaten all the base humans, and good riddance, because they're less sentient. And like I think that's reasonable, but like we've been talking about, and you brought up, John, Keaton is not remotely reliable of a narrator, and he doesn't seem to have much evidence for this.
Right.
So my thinking, and this is relatively speculative, I kind of think Rorschach actually won. So a big twist is that Rorschach engineered a new personality in Susan, the Gang of Four, made her the Gang of Five, and that's how it got control over Theseus. And this whole time, Keaton is beaming his thoughts on Rorschach back to Earth. So I think there is a mind virus from Rorschach encoded within Keaton's narration that is doing something to humans. And it might be making us less sentient to be more like them, or it might be making us more sentient so they can farm us. So I always want the monster to still be alive and to still be, biding its time in some way.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what I felt like was going on at the end.
That would explain, too, why I think one of the personalities of the Gang of Four doesn't want to talk to Keaton, because I guess like maybe it's being incubated to turn into the fifth one or something.
Right.
I mean, that definitely keeps the monster alive. So
Yeah, I don't know for sure. I mean, like I said, I haven't read the sequel yet. Maybe this does get answered in some way. I really don't know. But I definitely feel like Keaton, like one thing that I think is pretty clear by the end of this book is Keaton is racist against vampires.
Yeah.
Again, he kind of constantly has these justifications where it's like, oh, well, it's in your genes. Like you just see these things and you just hate them instinctually. And like, obviously like other characters are like kind of weirded out by vampires because they come, it's made pretty clear, like they come across like sociopaths, like
predator prey stuff.
No one seems to have like the same like kind of knee-jerk dislike for them that Keaton does. And I don't know, it's not really made clear, like, again, who brought vampires back, or like they're brought back because they're more intelligent, but like I don't know that with the powers that be, like, would there be enough vampires to take over the whole world? I don't know.
Right.
I feel like part of it is Keaton is, again, he's in this pod for decades. Like he's clearly going insane, I think, by the end. And I think his prejudice against vampires is basically going a little out of control. I think that, frankly, by the end of it, when he's hearing less radio chatter, I think, I mean, obviously it's a mystery, but I think part of what Watts is kind of saying here is that the pace of change in this world is so quick. Like, I don't remember exactly when this book came out, but like we're sitting in 2024. Theoretically, the future of this book is supposed to be like a little more or a little less than 60 years away.
Right.
I think there's maybe he's just been forgotten. Just whatever's going on Earth has totally superseded this at this point, and just no one cares that where he is or what he's coming back to. It could be because, yeah, like you said, Rorschach has come back and now like we're getting farmed by them instead of vampires, or it might just be that, oh yeah, like they found like a new thing to care about.
I like that. Yeah, that's fine. They're just over it all.
Yeah,
and he even talks about that.
We live in a world where the ex-president got shot 2 weeks ago, and already no one cares.
Sure. Right, because now there's a new, maybe future president.
Yeah, and in 2 weeks it'll be something else.
And she talked about a coconut tree one time. Like, come on. But you're right, John, because that's Watts talks about the Fermi paradox versus like the Sagan, Clarke, hopeful messianism paradigm about finding intelligent aliens, and he says the paradigm that won is no one gives a shit.
Yeah,
because we just have VR heaven. So they've played out every version of what's going to happen with Rorschach. So it's like Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League. It's a live service game that was forgotten 2 weeks after it came out.
Yeah, or he says at the beginning that they think they're like 15 years away from consciousness uploading, and maybe they just figured that out, and like all of humanity has just ascended into the new sphere, and there's like humanity actually has like won the game basically. Right. Kind of like, again, in the culture novels, like that's kind of the culture is like the one like high power civilization that won't just descend into the ether.
Right. Yeah.
Maybe humanity has decided to do that, and so no one cares about Rorschach because, hey, we actually got the better thing. I don't know. That's a hopeful reading.
Yeah. Also, too, though, like you mentioned his unreliability, and he's like, maybe I'm the last human left, and it's like, all right, sure. Like I'm sure you're real proud of yourself for getting your empathy back, but like there's obviously like other things happening. Yeah, at the end, so maybe they've just forgotten about him or something. So
sure.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, like I don't think Watts necessarily means for us to take Keaton's speculations particularly seriously.
Yeah, he says at the end, like, you'll just have to decide for yourself. Like, that's what Keaton says to him, or to the reader at the end.
Sure.
Yeah, I wonder, like, to your theory, Sam, I wonder what the virus would look like that makes them, like, maybe they all realize consciousness is a mistake. Like, that, like, vision that Keaton gets is, like, too seductive. Like, and that's where I go back to, like, I like that Watts takes these theories very seriously from, like, a rhetorical standpoint. Like, I will make the reader think that consciousness may be a mistake. Yeah, so...
Oh, yeah. Right. Yeah. I definitely feel like the first time I read this book, I found the argument being made by Keaton. I'm not going to say it's Watts's argument because I don't want to overstep. Sure. Right. I definitely found it very seductive, and it definitely like left me feeling pretty bleak. It's kind of been in the second read through, and again, this is one of the things I really like about doing the show and getting the opportunity to do these kind of rereads. I feel like I have a much more like nuanced view of like what's going on here, and the like what the mechanics of the story are. Yeah. The fact that Keaton is supposed to be very good at convincing you, but that doesn't necessarily make him right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think Watts is a really marvelous writer just for pulling that off so well.
Yeah. I think you're right. There's a way, and a younger me would have found this very seductive, that the anti-consciousness argument is a good anti-anxiety treatment. Like when you're wallowing in self-consciousness endlessly, it's kind of nice to think, oh, well, maybe this is just something that should be surpassed. Like hyperconsciousness leads to inertia, like Dostoevsky says. And my 22-year-old angsty self, if I had read this book back then, would have eaten that up and been all like, yeah, let's just stop wasting time thinking about thinking and just go out there and do stuff.
Yeah, that's like David Foster Wallace's whole bag is just talking about that, as opposed to just being like, yeah, what if we just didn't worry about this?
Sure.
Yeah, that is the Infinite Library's trademark position on the hard problem of consciousness. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, it don't matter, baby. Yeah, it don't matter,
worry
baby.
about it. Also, consciousness can give you a lot of fun stuff.
It's cool, and it makes for better predictions. You'll beat ChatGPT. You know, you won't know how you know.
As long as somebody,
it doesn't matter if you win, but you'll win.
As long as somebody doesn't shine a magnet into part of your brain when you're not expecting it and make you hallucinate things, like, you'll be fine.
Sure. Yeah, that is the scariest part. Like, I like convincing ways aliens can take over your mind without thinking about it.
Yeah.
Like, I was reading, what is it? There's another First Contact novel, which I'll have to look up. And one of the where they start having communication just by radio with advanced aliens, and they get really worried about them hacking us. Like a galactic level civilization could just send a radio transmission that would completely rewrite all computers on the Earth and take them to do whatever you want, and you could never know if it's there or not. So I like plausible ways to get around the light speed barrier and have aliens in us. And it's like the Descartes evil demon. You can't trust your eyes after a certain point.
I love, by the way, just a side note, I love the Descartes evil demon theory, because to me that explains like centuries of paranoia, which is just Descartes going like, am I being tricked by an evil demon? Which I always remember like I imagine Alex Jones being like, I have the documents, there is an evil demon, he's lying about my sensory apparatus. Like, it's such like foundational Western paranoia that I can't stop like thinking about it as like, this is where like people began to doubt their own brain. It's just Descartes like wondering if an evil demon is tricking him. So
yeah, I was thinking about The Listeners by James Gunn. That's the novel where we establish dialogue, and this president who's very hard-edged and cynical starts worrying about whether they're just hacking us, and there is a virus hidden in all this fairly innocuous sort of dialogue.
Cool. Interesting. Do you recommend the novel, or is this just kind of a cool?
No, it's really good. It similar to Watts, Gunn cares a lot about linguistics.
Cool.
And it's what inspired Carl Sagan to write Contact, which is to say Contact is a thinly veiled rip of James Gunn's The Listeners that got way more famous undeservedly. But the big thing in Gunn that's interesting is anti-cryptography. He thinks a lot about how to speak so that you will immediately be understood, no matter what, which is a similar problem to what Keaton is dealing with.
Yeah.
On how to condense something into the simplest, most digestible possible form, and then what may or may not happen. It's much more optimistic than Watts, but it's also good monologues, good dialogue, like really delves into the linguistic questions. How would you translate stuff like that?
Cool.
Yeah, do we want to do Rex now, or unless we got something else we want to mention?
I personally feel like I've covered all the ground I wanted to, but if you guys have more you want to talk about, I am happy to keep chatting.
I could quickly rec some other metal or hard rock sci-fi novels.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to swing around to that because I think it's a nice endpoint. As when Ben gave this to me and I, suggested it, I didn't really know what metal hard sci-fi was. I had an idea, or metal sci-fi, and I think you had made a note, Sam, about salvation from the depressing universe through aesthetics, which I think is a fairly good definition of metal sci-fi. And I'll keep tabs on if friend of the pod Ben agrees with that definition or not. But I think that's a pretty good one.
Yeah, so I talked about the aesthetics. So I would just quickly throw out 3 books that I think exemplify it. So one is Creatures of Light and Darkness by Roger Zelazny.
Hell yeah.
And it's a sci-fi retelling of ancient Egyptian mythology. And it never is clear how ancient aliens or how fantasy or how whatever it is. It sometimes seems to be both. And the most metal scene in that is, so Horus the god and the Steel General, who's like this robot who used to be a person who rides through history liberating stuff, have this epic duel using temporal fugue, where they keep traveling back and forward in time to duplicate themselves. And it starts out with just 2 guys fighting. And then by the end, it's like literal Dragon Ball Z, like smashing planets because there's just millions of them going on each other. Another book that struck me as pretty similar in a lot of ways to Blindsight would be Light by M. John Harrison. Either of you guys read that?
Yes, I love that book.
Yeah.
I'm a huge M. John Harrison
Yeah,
fan.
me too. So like I said, that's more hard rock and prog rock. Like there are planets named after King Crimson lyrics. For example, France Chants 4.
That's awesome.
But it leans into the space noir. Everyone's really modified. It leans into encounter with a weird alien beyond us, but takes the more classic Lovecraftian weird, where human science and technology just can't get a handle on this naked singularity that Kefauci tracked, but then these ancient aliens that were the only ones who were able to understand this thing. And then we get ghosts and aliens and time travel, and just leans into the weirdness of quantum mechanics. There's dice and cats and weird sex dreams and sexual dysfunction and serial killers. Pretty metal.
Ben, one of the main characters of Light is like a woman who is literally like merged herself with a whole spaceship. Yeah. And she just is a spaceship. But it's also a way of her like protecting herself from like childhood sexual trauma.
Yeah.
Holy crap.
And also the second book in the series is just a noir detective story.
Yeah. Where they buy a bar at the end and everything's nice.
That sounds great.
It's pretty sick. And then the last book.
Go ahead.
I say quickly, I recommend this to everyone, but prose poetic book called Dark Matter by the Swedish poet Asa Berg. And it's semi-narrative. I think it's about the experience of being the friend or lover of a succession of eldritch beings. So if you like the parts of Blindsight that are about your body being ripped apart and put back together and your mind getting ripped apart by radiation and magnetism, imagine the extreme lyrical poesis, like apotheosis of that aesthetically. It's pretty glorious.
Yeah, Sam, that has been on my list since you told me about it, and it's just never made it to the top. So I am going to read that.
I believe you.
Yeah.
If I could piggyback a little bit on those recs, just to throw out some sci-fi I really love. I think that still remains fairly metal. My favorite Zelazny is without a doubt Lord of Light, which is his kind of deconstructionist retelling of the Buddha myth that has some really cool kind of twists and turns in there. I don't want to spoil it. Maybe we'll do it for the pod eventually, but I think that is some of the absolute best of 60s science fiction, some of the best of Zelazny. I'm a huge Zelazny head.
Yeah.
I think he's one of my favorite authors just ever. And then 2, in terms of kind of really bleak, horrifying books about trying to communicate with aliens. All right, it's not a book, actually, it's a short story. But Spar by Kij Johnson.
Yeah.
Sam, you know that one?
Yeah, I've read Spar.
Yeah, so Ben, Spar is a short story by Kij Johnson, who's an absolutely like one of the best short story authors like working today. But it's about an astronaut who ends up on a spaceship with a kind of a vaguely amorphous alien, and essentially the only way they can figure out how to communicate with one another is by sexually assaulting each other.
Yeah.
Holy crap.
Yeah. And it's a really like horrifying story about like, yeah, how do you communicate with something that you just should not be in the same like solar system with, and like how impossible that probably is.
Yeah, no, it's a great story. I believe it won the Hugo Award, and I taught it to my undergrads when I used to teach intro to fiction writing at CU Boulder as a sci-fi story. And to their credit, with just a little bit of content warning and context, they were actually really into it. Like they were able to wrap their minds around it. I was pretty proud of them.
Cool. Yeah, I guess I don't have enough metal sci-fi recs, but I did read Annex by Blake Butler, which I've mentioned on this pod before. Blake Butler, I believe, is sort of like a alt fiction guru. He helped found HTML Giant, which is now defunct, but there was a lot of like alt writers who would post on that. But Annex is like, I think it takes place in a world where Satan is in complete control, and he has rewritten the Bible so that everyone is trapped in VR headsets, and all of their energy is being siphoned away toward making what are known as control films, which are essentially just where you load propaganda, your force-fed propaganda that like is your complete reality. And one of the characters is a Gen X musician named Mr. Mustard, who then becomes a war criminal. So and honestly, like he gets one unbroken monologue where like he's justifying all of his decisions, and it's absolutely some gonzo writing. There's a lot of like Burroughs sort of Joycean like pun like nonsense word stuff. There's also like at no point is any of this explained, so I might be entirely wrong with my exposition summary, but really kind of a trip in terms of like brutal aesthetics that are sci-fi, and then there is some transcendence at the end because I think all of the characters take some drug and then just like die. I don't know. It's crazy stuff. Definitely what I'd put under metal sci-fi.
I got one more metal sci-fi recommendation that, Ben, your recommendation just reminded me of, and that is the absolute banger classic, The Star's My Destination. Oh man, that is one of the hardest core books I think I've ever read. Have either of you read it?
Yeah, I haven't thought of that as metal though. Why would you call that metal?
I mean, it's like this guy, like he like goes through the entire universe on like this insane revenge quest and like develops like yogic superpowers by taking a bunch of drugs. Like he has like the tiger tattoos on his face that he has to like that flare up whenever he gets angry. I think that book is super like it's hardcore in like a 50s like beat way.
Still
though, that sounds like dope.
It's as metal as you could get if you were writing something in 1954.
No, you convinced me. That's compelling. But it's also, speaking of developing Donzo superpowers for petty revenge, have any of you read the Radix novels by A.T. Atanasio?
No.
So there's a handful of these. The best ones are Radix, the first one, and then The Last Legends of Earth, the fourth one. And Radix is in like a fairly polluted near future. Our main character is just this loser who gets picked on and abused, and eventually recruited by super soldiers, and through just painstaking kung fu training, turns himself into a super soldier. And then we also find out that there are people called Vors who have been semi-possessed by dead aliens.
Wow.
That psychically send their souls through the universe and land in human brains because the brain is like a receiver for cosmic rays. And you gain powers from interfacing with these things. there's like a 4-page sequence where he goes to a society where he goes to Gorilla City, basically. And there are these super intelligent apes who are way better at the super science and super kung fu than we are. And you're only there for 4 pages and then you're gone. And you like want to know more about these apes. But so those books get pretty wild and like, 70s prog rock, Yes album sort of nonsense. But it's pretty metal because there's still big fighting. And there are these aliens called rim stalkers in the sequels that feed off pain. So they can't kill you. They just have to put you in the worst possible hell simulation world so they can eat your pain forever. So like that's pretty metal.
That's pretty metal. Yeah.
Pretty metal.
The Radix novels? Is that what you
Radix, yeah.
Yeah, I'm looking at the Wikipedia page right now and I'm getting kind of some Book of the New Sun vibes, maybe.
A little, but like way less disciplined than Wolf. Like
that's fair.
The raggedy hippie version of the Book of the New Sun would be a reasonable way to describe it.
Yeah, it's Book of the New Sun without Wolf's constant guiding light of trying to get you to become Catholic by the end of it.
Yeah, and almost got me. I'm not gonna lie.
No shame in that.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, if it's gonna be one person, it might as well be him. So, like,
yeah. Gene Wolfe, one of the finest synthesis the Catholic Church has ever known.
Well, I told you there's that Gaiman write-up where he's like, Gene Wolfe, the one man who could commit a murder and get away with it. And he's also the guy, and Gaiman, like, he says that, I'm like, I buy that totally. Like, yeah.
Right, yeah, it's pretty funny.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, Wolf also one of the authors I'm most glad is dead because I would not want to know what he thinks about most things going on in the world today.
Yeah, I read Pirate Freedom, which was pretty good, and like I think he wrote that in 2008. And it's just about pirates, and it's like very fun and historically researched. And then there's just a random rant about why sex abuse by Catholic priests isn't a problem. It's like, well, they're 14. When I was a kid, we didn't think of 14-year-olds as boys, and they just wanted it.
What?
And it's just some pirate saying this, and it's so out of nowhere that it's like, wow, that was just your soapbox, like, Rush Limbaugh rant of the day, Gene.
Jesus Christ. Right. Yeah, John, I think that totally confirms your theory that it's not good that he's, like, around.
Yeah.
I would not have liked to have seen I think he would have been a manga guy.
Yeah, right. And would have been really good at selling it.
Yeah, I like the idea that he did all that research and that he just can't help himself. Like
Sure.
Oh man. Oh Lord. All right. Well, why don't we start drawing it to a close? And if we want to keep chit-chatting, we can, but I feel like we don't want to just keep telling people to read other books because
sure.
Ben and I started doing that on the show, and they were like, "We're already like telling people to read one book an episode. Do we really want to give them like 3 more to read at the end of every episode?"
Sure.
Well, and I also did want to do it because I liked the idea of metal sci-fi. That was like what this was sold to me as. Yeah.
No, we just don't do it every episode anymore.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Sam, thank you so much for joining us today on the show. It's been a real pleasure to have you. Do you have anything you want to plug for the audience before we call it a day?
No, thanks for inviting me. This was super fun. I will say I'm working on a dissertation about the Lovecraftian, particularly how contemporary writers in the last 10 years have revised Lovecraft and used his old ones as beautiful allegories for climate change and neo-fascism and stuff like that. So that might be hitting an academic press or a conference circuit in a little bit, a year or two. So if you have any interest in that, check out what I'm calling The Edge of Cognition by Samuel Chirtel.
I think that I'll at least be interested in reading that, and I'm guessing at least some of our audience will as well. Sam, curious, just because we had her on for our last episode, do you talk about any works by Molly Tanzer in that?
I have not. What is she like?
She just is someone who has definitely done a lot of work in kind of contemporary Lovecraftiana. I'd be happy to recommend a couple works to you off
totally.
mic.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm always looking for more authors to fit into this. So
yeah, no.
The chapter
some interesting stuff.
Yeah, the chapter I just finished a draft of is about ecofiction. So I mostly talk about Reza Negarestani's Cyclonopedia because oil is the old ones in that.
We're gonna cover that in a future episode. Is the plan?
Oh no way! I didn't. Oh yeah, that's such a. I won't say too much. That's such a wild batshit, like so hard to even get a handle on book.
Yeah, we might be biting off more than we can chew. But you're the first person I've ever met who's also read that book.
Oh no way!
And I need Ben to read it so that I can know if it's actually good or.
That's good. You're the third person I've met. But no, you're the third person I know of, including myself and my thesis advisor who assigned me to read it, who has read that book.
Yeah, that's also been on my list, and I just have not got around to it, which is one of the joys of the Infinite Library is that you can be like, we're reading this book now. So, yeah.
Well, maybe we'll have to have you on when we do that episode or chat with you about it.
Back.
Cool.
All right.
Well, thanks so much again.
Yeah.
And
thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Make sure to check out Sam's dissertation. We'll make sure to let you guys know when it officially comes out. But until next, not next week, but 2 weeks from now, I'm John.
I'm Ben.
I'm Sam. Semper Books.
Thank you for listening to the Infinite Library. If you liked our show, we hope you'll subscribe and leave us a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or the podcast app of your choice. It helps us a lot. If you want to follow us on social media, we can be found on Twitter, Instagram, and Blue Sky at Infinite Library Pod. If you'd like to contact our team directly with episode ideas or feedback, you can email us at infinitelibrarypod@gmail.com. Our intro music is by Amos Legend in the Forest of Mayhem. Our outro music is by DJ Daggy Diggs, and our logo was created by Lars Noir. You can support our show by supporting them. We hope you'll join us back in the stacks for the next episode soon. Semper Books, bookheads.